Hi, I'm Kate Elliott, and I'm here with Season 4, the premiere episode of Season 4 of Narrative Worlds. And to remind some of you who may have been waiting or haven't been here before, Narrative Worlds is a series where I and another writer, my guest, dig into the idea of narrative worlds and the theory and practice of building, but also the craft of writing and the career of writing. And it's meant as a dialogue, not a panel. We'll chat. I love inviting people who I just want to have a chance to chat for an hour with, who I live too far from to go hang out at a coffee shop. So really, it's just an excuse for me to talk to people I know. So that's the truth. So anyway, we'll talk for about anywhere from 40 to 50 minutes. If there are questions, and I know we have some people here listening in, if there's questions, please put them in the Q&A and we'll answer them at the end. And then when it's over, it will be put up on SFWA's YouTube channel. I think, and then the last thing that I always say is that this series is not about a goal. It's not a lesson. It's a discussion by professionals about some aspect of craft or career. There's no secret handshake. Just take from us what you will, discard the rest. And mostly, we just hope you enjoy listening to us chat about something we're both passionate about. Which brings me today to today's guest, Shannon Chakraborty, who writes fantasy fiction that's also historical fiction, and maybe it's just fiction with an element that may seem fantastic to some people, but isn't really fantastic in the context of its time. And our title today that we agreed on was Beyond. Oh, hold on. Hold on. She wrote the Daevabad trilogy, the River of Silver short fiction collection. Excuse me. I haven't had enough caffeine yet. And her most recent novel is The Adventures of Amina al-Sarafi, which is the story of a medieval pirate who goes on one last job. And is there anything you want to add to that, Shannon?
No, I think that pretty much covers it. I suspect we'll get into the conversation, and I will try to talk about my books occasionally. I'm very bad about doing that when I'm doing panels or conversations. I just like to talk about the topic.
Hold on. Yeah. So I wanted to say to you, I forgot to tell you this before we started, which is this is a discussion in which it's totally fine to say, by the way, this is how I did it when I was working on this, because I think a lot of the people listening to this want those details, that nitty gritty that they can say, oh, okay, that's how she did it, as opposed to those panels where you don't kind of want people to go on and on about themselves, right? But this is that time to go on and on about what exactly you did and why.
Okay, so I have permission to talk just for 50 minutes about like Islamic mysticism in the 12th century.
Well, you have it from me, so who else matters, right? I need to know. Oh God, no. Okay, I'll be good. No, I won't be good. Never mind. Okay, so we're going to talk about, because we're both actually, I think, kind of geeky, nerdy, dorky in the same way about history and about this stuff. So our title today is Beyond Background Filler: History and Religion as Foundational Structures in World Building. So I wanted to start by asking you to maybe a little bit of definition, and I want to do that thing where maybe we start a little bit of definitional by starting with the negative. So what to you are the characteristics of a world in like science fiction, fantasy, or historical novels in which you as a reader or as with your writer hat on perceive that the history and religion are being treated as background filler? Like, in other words, what in your mind is background filler? I know what's in my mind as it, and how can you tell? What does it look like when you're reading?
I think I hate to start like the conversation on like picking on other negative notes, but I joke, I often feel like I write not to write fantasy fiction, but to deal with my feelings about like history and religion and the history of religion in story form. So for me, I like to very much feel the history and the weight and have an organic sense of what the world should be. And I think it's something that you can sometimes feel when it's a little tacked on and it's not fleshed out. And just like you said in the beginning, there's no right or wrong way to develop something. But I think world building is a great term because you are building a world. And I mean, our society is built up. It's like, how do you define culture? How do you define society?
Yeah.
You can't even do something like that concisely. So I think, you know, when you want to just like, oh, I'd like to take my little historical world, if you don't really think about that, you're going to bring your own society into it. And that's fine. Maybe that's what you want to do. But I think sometimes for me, especially when I'm reading fantasy, sometimes I can feel like what feels like the weight of like the Reformation on top of some fictions of, you know, like every religion becomes like Catholicism during the Inquisition. And if that's what you want to do, that's fine. But I think we have sometimes our own weight and judgment of religion and the past can be very heavy on your book. And if you're writing a book, especially if you're writing historical fiction, that's not necessarily how the people who are living in that period would feel it. And so sometimes for me that will jut out of, well, why is this? why do they suddenly feel this way about their society? Shouldn't there be questions? You know, like I can like I said, I can feel the weight of like the past 200 years of Christianity.
Yeah, that's actually, I completely agree with you. It's that, and I think a lot of times people don't realize what they're bringing in. You know, it's an interesting question too. I love what you said about the fantasy religions that look like the Catholicism during the Inquisition, because I could just offhand, and I won't mention them, because like you, I don't like to start with the negative. I'm just trying to start with the definitional, I guess. And I don't care. It's like it's hard because it feels like an easy choice, but it also feels like a shallow choice. And more than anything, when I write, I want to have the world feel deep. I want it to feel like there's an ocean there with layers, and the layers are the history, and the layers are the way people understand their relationship to the world, you know, and religion is part of that way that they understand it. Because the other side of that, besides the inquisitional type of religion, is what I call the credulous religion. You know, oh, everyone in the Middle Ages was credulous, and they were very simple-minded folk who believed everything the same, but they weren't. If you look at anything, when I was writing Crown of Stars, my eldest sister is a medievalist, and I did a lot of reading on early medieval Europe. A lot of well, I was going to say way too much, but no, it wasn't way too much. It was
the exact amount.
it was, you know, probably not enough. I'm sure it wasn't enough. But oh no, this was before Crown of Stars. This was when I was writing the Geron books, the fourth Geron book, and I had a scene where so it's kind of a late medieval type of setting, but not analogous to anything in our world. But I had a scene where a prince is pursuing somebody, and I said to my sister, would he pursue them into a church and kill the enemy? And she goes, yeah, why not? And I go, well, but wouldn't he, you know? And she goes, right. She's like, he's a prince. This is about power.
Yeah.
Does the church have the power to punish him for it? No. Well then, right? There is a whole sequence. Then later I read the whole Ottonian sequence where, in fact, one of the half brothers of Otto is pursued by somebody into a church, and they kill him because they want to get in good with Otto, you know, or maybe it was Henry. I don't know. I did that research. So yeah, there's all these, we're constantly fighting. Part of background filler is fighting the baggage we're bringing.
Exactly. And you might not even realize it. I mean, I like to think to myself, one of the reasons I love writing historical inspired fiction and fantasy is because it just gives me an excuse to learn more about fantasy. And I always joke, one of the things I love about history is that it's constantly changing, that our interpretations are constantly changing.
Yes.
So you're consistently learning new things. So I started writing my most recent book, The Adventures of Amina Sarafi. And I thought I went into it very open-minded about like what I knew about, you know, the 12th century and medieval period in the Middle East in terms of their conceptions of magic. And I thought my feelings were very open-minded. Oh, I know it was more prevalent. I know the courts had astrologers. I know you would have used small magics in everyday life, but I still had a main character at that point who, because I mean, this is fantasy, so because of a sort of an interaction she had with magic earlier in her life that was very negative, she is very negative. So she goes into this library essentially of the occult and is talking very negatively about the talismans and the amulets and the hanging knots and the books she sees. And I was working with a historian of the occult on it, and she read it and she was like, you're bringing, you know, your own very like modern orthodox views in it too, that I had so tried not to. And you know, she pointed out that again, you know, it's like you need to hear it again, that these top religious theologians would have also believed in this, would have practiced this, just because, you know, nowadays we don't necessarily like, oh, that's superstition and this is religion, and they have a neat line and never the two shall cross, which of course is nonsense. But it was really interesting to hear that for as much as I tried to show that it was a normal part of practice, I was still had too much of a modern view of it. And it was interesting. And I think I like learning that. I like doing, you know, kind of having those humbling moments of, oh, you thought you knew what you were
Yeah.
talking about? No, like, let's go back to the basics.
You know, that's actually a really good point about curiosity and learning, because one of the things I love most about doing research, and the excuse writing a book gives me to do research, is I love learning these things, because I'm like, whoa, I had no idea. Who knew, right? And I love that. Like, what is not to love about this connection with the past, where all of a sudden you see this little thing. I'm reading about the Sogdian letters right now, right? Right, and they were found in a watchtower just beyond the Chinese border. So clearly they got that far, and then something terrible happened, and they never moved on. So, you know, there's a story right there, right? And not to mention, then anyway, there's so much, you know. So actually, since you brought up the medieval Indian Ocean, I wanted to ask you how, you know, we have such a weight of history and religion from the Western perspective in the fantasy that we read and the fantasy that so many write. How did that affect your decision in the way of how you were going to proceed when you decided to do the medieval Indian Ocean, which is this incredibly rich culture area about which many of your readers would know very little, and others of your readers would think they knew something, and then not to mention other readers who would actually know. So you're juggling a lot of stuff there. Can you talk about that process? How did you prepare yourself?
Yeah.
I know it's a huge question.
You know what? It's not a huge question, because I feel like I've gotten aspects of this question, and it's something I do like to talk about, because I like to talk, especially, you know, if anybody who is writing about a non-Western or from a non-Western perspective can think about this. One, I went into it little bit complicated, because I sort of fell into writing fantasy. I wanted to go back to graduate school and be a medievalist of essentially the area that I wrote about in my last book, of the medieval Islamic world, and particularly the Indian Ocean networks. I wanted to talk about the Sinbad stories, and a lot of how trade and cultural diasporas transmitted sometimes fairy tales, sometimes seafaring stories. So that was all like what I wanted to do.
I love this all. I'm sorry.
No, it's funny because now I get the question, people be like, oh, so, you know, like, why? I'm like, I couldn't tell you what the 100 Years' War is about. I know it's important to European history, but like, you know, it's funny. People was like, oh, you know, what you study is so unknown. I'm like, not to me. Like, it's kind of the reverse. Like, now I'm listening to podcasts to learn about, like, you know, European history. So in presenting that, and then kind of thinking about that more, especially after my last trilogy came out, trying to think of like a way to frame this. That doesn't feel like it feels like too much work on other writers. But I think if you write historically inspired worlds today, you must be aware that the stories about the medieval world and the ancient world, particularly very popular tales, do have a very large impact on what the lay population believes about the medieval world. And typically they'd have a horribly skewed interpretation about the medieval world because of this. I mean, how many times have we heard, oh, don't you know that rape was prevalent all over Western Europe because this, it's because this book said it or that book said it.
Yeah.
And, you have to kind of take back, well, what do you know from actual history that, again, we're constantly learning new things. And what do you know from stories about history? So I went into writing my last book with that very heavy on my mind, because I was writing one about the 12th century Islamic world, which is a term we can, expand out, especially the part that I write about. That was
Did we freeze? Oh,
yes.
All right. Are you back?
I'm back.
Excellent.
Okay.
So you said it was weighed heavy on your mind.
Yes.
That's what I last heard.
Okay. So I wanted to really think about that, because I was writing about a time and a place that, yes, I knew a lot of readers would not know about. I knew a lot of readers would know about. And I was doing it with sort of different feet and different perspectives, because I'm American. I'm from a Western background. I am a Muslim, but that's not my cultural heritage, the Indian Ocean. So I wanted to write something that I wanted to make it as historically accurate as possible, except for the plot. Because if I wrote a female character who owned her own resources, who was, a frequent divorcee, and I had perspectives, which I did have from the Western audience, oh, Muslim women in this time and age, they would have never had freedom like that, blah, 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 blah. I wanted to feel confident in my historical footing to say, okay, I have my sources, you show me your sources. So I try to make it as historically accurate as possible for that reason. And with the idea that I knew a lot of people were going to be coming to this new, or even, coming to it thinking they knew, like I did. I consider myself fairly knowledgeable about this time. And even I was like, oh, wow, I knew magic was prevalent, but not that prevalent. I write about queer relationships and queer identities. They would not have had that word, but I mean, I've got my sources and it's prevalent. I remember I had pushed back for that. Oh, you can't write about this. People won't think it's realistic. And I said to not write about it would not be realistic. It's all over the time period. They had a different view of it, of course. And I'm not one for apologetics of saying like, oh, this time and place did it better. Absolutely not. They did it differently, but it existed. So I felt like for these books in particular, because I was saying, in a way, this is my best understanding of this time period, I felt like I had to get it as accurate as possible. That being said, I don't feel like that's a responsibility, especially like if you are coming from a marginalized cultural identity. A lot of people are interacting with myth and with fantasy and with history in a way that's not quite written. I think we see a lot of like, The Adventures of Amin al-Sarafi takes place in Yemen. It takes place in, where else do I go in there? Mogadishu, Socotra.
Socotra Island.
Yeah. These are real places. These were real places with real histories. I don't think that same weight of research and responsibility should necessarily be on those who are writing secondary worlds inspired by their own cultural heritage.
Right. Right. I'm struck by all of this, but also this idea that as a writer, when we're setting something and basing it on actual Earth history, right, that we have I don't that there is not a responsibility, because I don't want to use that word, like you said, it's a tough word, but that we need to realize that some readers will take what we're saying as the way it was, just the way that we see views of medieval Europe, for example, that are wrong, or that don't represent medieval Europe, which is a period of time that is, it's over 1,000 years and different regions with different things going on. you know, or the idea that, well, women couldn't own property in medieval Islam. Well, gosh, I mean, it's just wrong. It's just women actually economically probably had more, I mean, you know, way more economic rights, just filtered differently than what we're used to, right? And so we're like constantly, one of the things that I think about as a writer is, what am I telling people that they won't believe?
Yes.
But I still have to say it, because otherwise I'm like giving into that false narrative that people have built on, because it's easier, because it gives them, you know, because they're satisfied. They find the prejudicial idea satisfying. And I think we're always fighting about that. I mean, I think we as writers, we can be struggling against that all the time. And that's kind of a big deal to say, no, this is really what it was like. Based on the research I did, there's more stuff I don't know, you know.
And I think also, you know, and this is in talking about history and writing history, I also like to kind of tell people and keep for myself in mind to, as much as possible, think about what their concerns were. And this was even this actually really, because I write, it takes place during the Crusades, but it takes place in a region that the Crusades would have been sort of this distant threat. And I knew, you know, like we've now, I mean, books have been written perception of the Crusades in popular culture, in all different places. But in that, even that, I didn't want to fall into the trap of looking at the Crusades through, you know, the later ideas of colonialism, because that's not what it would have looked like to them back then. I tried to have the idea that for, you know, a Muslim living in Southern Arabia, it may have seemed a distant threat. It would have been something you would have heard about on Friday. People would have been taking up donations. Anyone in sort of trading or mercantile circles would have had family up there who would have been affected, but it wouldn't have been seen in this sort of civilization battle that now in the 21st century we talk about. And even that was a difficult line to thread, because I didn't want people to say, oh, you're depicting it too horribly, or you're not depicting it horribly enough. Right. No, I was trying to depict it as the sources of the time would have shown, and it was a lot messier than people, you know, want to believe.
It's the constant struggle of writing books with fantastical elements that are based in history. I'm interested to hear, you know, one of the things that this was true in Crown of Stars, which is heavily based in early medieval Europe, but it isn't set in early medieval Europe. It's set in an analog, which I did because I wanted there to literally be large dragons, you know, at one point. And because my background is Scandinavian American, I wanted the Vikings to be not quite, only partially human, like some people said, you know, like the churchmen of Northern England were like, they're not really people. And I felt like I could like make that kind of, so it's not, but at the same time, I felt that I had to do, as you say, I had to think about what the people living there, how they would approach things. And to them, this idea of things that I'm going to say the modern Western skepticism that some have, that which is that the supernatural doesn't exist. I had to understand the world as they did, not as I might approach it. And you do that, I think, very successfully with the adventures, with your most recent novel, and actually with the trilogy as well. It's taken at face value. And to me, that's part of what makes it more than background filler. It's not like I'm sticking these things on here because I expect them to be there in a fantasy, but that the people are experiencing this in a way that is true to their way of living in the world.
Well, and I think that's important. I know, listen, not a lot of people, there are a lot of people today are like, I hate religion. It's, you know, the foundation of all evil and wars and violence. And you know what? There's arguments to be made there. But I tell writers who are world building, it doesn't actually matter if you like religion or not, because if you're trying to take inspiration from human culture and society, it is a bedrock. It has been there since we started telling tales. Again, where's the line between magic and fantasy and myth and religion? It's all entwined. And to ignore that, to ignore this huge impact in human society, your works might feel lesser for that. I mean, we were originally supposed to have this conversation, I think, back in winter before I had pregnancy chaos. But I always say December is my favorite time to live in a secular country. Why do we have the holidays we have? You know, why are the names I mean, you want to talk about like layers of forgotten history and fantasy.
Yeah.
What we call the days of the week, what we call our months, our whole system
Yeah.
of understanding things, of, you know, it's like, it's just because you don't go to church or you don't go to temple or mosque or whatever, it's still very baked into our world. It's baked into our government. I mean,
Into our calendar.
into our calendar. I mean,
on levels.
Yeah.
We've got the Sumerian level and we've got the Roman Latin level, and
Yeah.
you know,
I mean, we right now have religious systems that are influencing our politics, regardless of whether or not you belong to them or believe in them.
Yeah.
So I think to just sort of excise that whole element or not really address it in world building, you may be left with a shallower world. You should really think, when you're constructing your world and your characters, think about all their actions, how their days are set, their views and their duties to themselves, to their culture. I mean, even the very way we tell stories is impacted by religion. I often think a lot of Western fantasy is very wrapped up into this idea of the redemption myth. Well, why? What redemption myth, dear Christians, what do you think you could be inspired by? You know, that absolutely takes effect. I think in a lot of medieval Islamic fantasy, when you have the idea of jinn or spirits that are in existence, you just can't see them. That also depends on, you tell fantasy different. You know, the shadows in your room are going to have a different meaning than ghosts or fairies or fae. So I think, even again, you don't have to be a practitioner of anything, but it majorly impacts how people and society, their daily lives, are set up. So even when I was writing, and I think I tried to do this in different ways, but when I was writing the Daevabad trilogy, which was historically inspired, not quite to what feels like the same insane degree as my last book, but I wanted to kind of show that even the society of Daevabad, it's loosely based on Islamic mores, just like the idea of, you know, the Abbasid or the other sultanates of this time would have been loosely based. You know, I had a lot of people, they'd be like, well, why does the king drink? Or like if you don't think royal rulers were drinking wine, they were drawing up poems about wine. You don't always believe, but it's still sort of a foundational level of your government, of your holidays. I tried to talk about, you know, in drawing the actual fictional world of the Devas and their traditions. Okay, how might have, you know, I gave them a holiday. It was like marking the idea of their queen who founded the city. And I tried to pull back from ideas of ancient Persian ideas of like some of the celebrations, but also think about the story and the plot that I had invented. And then what might have their holiday looked like? How might they have celebrated with a parade? What sort of items and tokens and foods would they have consumed and shown? So I think, you know, you really, that stuff should matter. It should really be in the weight of everything that people do.
You know, obviously I agree, being like, we're like practically twin writers in this sense of what we like to do. And it occurs to me there, I mean, there's a whole other element in there, is when I remember reading years and years and years and years ago a book where it's like, make sure you make a history timeline so you know what happened when, which, you know, king so-and-so reigned from here to here, and then there was this war there and a border dispute and then another king and whatever. And I think, and then here's the religion, here's the 3 precepts, and this is how they dress, and you know, whatever. But what I want to see, that's all very well, but what I want to see is what's real in every human society. All of these things are completely woven together, so woven together that you have to, as you said, really, really stop yourself and think, why are the days of the week called that? And why do we celebrate this secular, why do we have this day off that everybody has off, you know, regardless? And that they can't be pulled apart. They can't even be seen in isolation, because religion, which as far as we know is one of the, I mean, I feel safe to say that the religious impulse comes before the historical impulse.
Yeah,
If we look
I
at,
mean,
you
yes,
know,
I think we have artifact. I mean, you could say we have artifacts
artifacts,
most
yeah,
certainly attesting to belief before we have people writing them or reporting them, at least in ways that we can tell.
right, right. I mean, we don't, people, I'm sure almost certainly made lists in their, you know, made oral lists and oral histories. So, but we definitely have archaeological proof that people had some kind of, you know, burying someone,
Yeah.
burying a Neanderthal with something, a piece of ochre or, you know, a bead. That means something. That doesn't mean nothing. It's not just some random thing. It means something. And for me, that's where the things start to weave together. You know, here is the history, and then how does the religion and how do they weave together, and how are they not monolithic? You talked a little bit about Islamic mysticism of this era, and people often think of Islam as the 19th century Wahhabism, right? Which is, it's 19th century, right? Is
Earlier than that, actually, but yeah.
early 18th. Sorry, I'm not good.
No,
Just
okay.
the same way you can look at certain forms of ultra Orthodox Judaism, which really are rather late in the history of Judaism. And they're often seen as these are the ways it is. But actually, if you look before that, it's much more complicated. And there's many more strands. And you use those things when you write. You show those different strands and the way they interact with the choices that rulers are making, the choices that everyday people are making.
And I think that's natural. I mean, this was sort of answering and also kind of getting back to something you were saying before. Again, when you're crafting a story and you're talking, if you want to show a wide breadth, especially if you're writing, say, epic fantasy, and you want to feel you have character points of view from different perspectives. I think we also need to keep in mind that religion looked very different on different societal levels. I've been reading this great book that's called Doubt. I think it's called Doubt. But it's essentially the history of skepticism and atheism, almost as it gets closer in history, very much Western European focus. But he really has a great point. The author makes a really nice effort to get the voices of very common people, which is something you don't always find in history. But they make a very good point, and I think he puts it more succinctly than I can remember. Of in pre-modern worlds, you did not have this level of fundamentalism we think of, because there was really no way to enforce it. If you have your dotted rural settlements, you know, hundreds of miles apart from each other and everything, they're not necessarily going to have a priest that comes in and says, okay, everybody has to do X, Y, and Z. You can't get married unless I'm here. I think we forget that level of control of society. I mean, to say nothing of the world we live in, where you can, you know, monitor people, it just didn't exist.
Yeah.
And the idea of, yes, there were absolutely, you know, like, I mean, we talk about witches being burned. Rules were absolutely there, but I think we think they were enforced in a way that was probably not possible across societies. So, yes, when you're making your society, your court scribe should probably have a different understanding than, say, his relatives back in the village, you know, a 3 days march. I don't know why he would march. That would be a strange thing for a scribe to do, but you know what I mean.
He would amble.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I think it's fair to say, obviously, people should have different perspectives. When I was writing the adventures of Amin Asarafi, I also wanted to make my main character, for the time and place and for everything, she's religious, she's devout. She's also a former criminal. So how would that weigh in? She's a former criminal. She's a woman who has lived a very varied life and is absolutely going to have different opinions on her faith and religion than, say, another crewmate of hers who's either younger or older or a bit more orthodox. And that should feel real. That should feel real both for the time and place. And I did want to make sure, I read a lot of, like, you know, period pieces and contemporary accounts to make sure that kind of belief would be there. But people would still have different ideas of religion and faith, and we can look at it back in the past. Even like I said, I'll maybe also find the name of this book, because I was just very taken with the idea of, they were talking about the regular people. You can have, okay, the Inquisition caught up this very formative thinker who wrote all these blasphemous pieces. But what did it mean for, the more normal man who might start to lose his faith when he can't pay his, I'm going to forget the Christian term for what you pay the church, tithe, yes.
Yeah, I think so.
When, paying his tithe means he can't feed his children. Or, what did it mean for a woman who just prayed constantly and constantly for essentially to have children and not suffer miscarriages and have that loss of faith? I think we always think, oh, it was, back then everybody just they believed, but people are fallible. And I think they have that impulse to look at the world, all times, to record this and go, how can there be something better? I think that's a natural human impulse. And I think there are ways to capture that in books, even if you're trying to talk about a very religious society.
And I think, to piggyback off what you're saying, is there's also layers of belief, because Christianity as well as Islam come into and over already set long-standing belief systems. So you see, like people think that Islam came, the conquests came through pretty quickly in a fairly reasonably short period of time. But in fact, Zoroastrianism still exists. Now, not much, right? But it means that 400 years ago, Zoroastrianism was probably rather more widespread, kind of out at the margins. But it wasn't, it wasn't like the Persian was spoken for, the Shahnameh's written, not in Arabic, because it was still a strong, even a couple hundred years after the Islamic conquest, the villages may or may not have been Islamic, or they may have been syncretic. They may have had, and you see this in Europe all the time, where Christianity comes in as this layer over, but the village people are still worshiping at that spring. And maybe they say it's Saint Bridget now instead of, whoever was there before. There's this great French movie from I want to say the 80s, called Sorceress. And it's this little French village where they still have an old tree in the forest, and a woman who tends it, who also is a healer, right? And then this Dominican comes walking through, he's looking, right, for heresy, and he immediately pinpoints this as bad. And of course, he's quite good looking. And of course, the sorceress is this young, beautiful woman, right? So he arrests her. But the village people are not really cowed by him. And then there's a whole secondary plot about the lord of the manor, who, again, with people who don't have enough to feed their kids, and a man is imprisoned, and he's not given food and drink, and the way the women of the village figure out to save his life. I'm sorry, people, this is all great storytelling, is that his breastfeeding wife comes in and nurses him, and so it saves his life.
That's the thing. Isn't there in Italy, there's like the same story. There was a saint who got that.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah.
She got her father through the through prison bars or something.
Yeah, but in the end, the Dominican leaves. He's defeated, and he leaves the village, and there they're left with their Christian church, which they pray at, and their old tree, and their healing woman from this older tradition. And so you see these layers, and these layers exist. They still exist. Yeah. And think these things are like this monolithic single line, it's just not real to human. It's just not how people live. No, and so when I read fantasy that has this idea of there's a single line and one belief, and everyone believes the same thing and practices the same way, no matter whether they're a retired criminal who believes, her belief, Amina's belief feels so real to me in the book because it's complicated. Anyway.
And it's also, I think we often think that these are always in opposition, and they're often not, because the
Yeah.
syncretism
Yeah.
is the result of essentially like an organic process that goes throughout generations,
Yeah.
and that, that's going to feel real to people. I mean, if you tell someone, oh, that jinn story you had that has roots, I mean, there's one in North Africa, it's very clearly an old Phoenician deity, like, that has now been transformed into a jinn story. Like, you can look at the name, you can look at the story, it's
What's
there.
the name? What's the name?
It's not
It's not
is
some
it,
Baal variant.
no, I was telling you in the beginning, I feel bad. I'm gonna have to go back and write down names because
Yeah, yeah, you gotta
very
give me your
sleep-deprived
source books.
7.5
Yeah,
month
yeah, yeah,
but
yeah. You're
I
doing
mean,
great, by the way.
that's absolutely, I love the fact that even, in Egypt, I mean, which has been, it was, and Egypt itself, that history can sometimes be misunderstood, because that they stayed Christian, they stayed majority Christian for centuries,
Yeah,
even after
yeah,
conquest.
yeah.
But even before the Christianity, I mean, nobody does tombs and funerary services like the Egyptians.
Nobody.
Even today, I mean, you can see, threading back to a far, far more ancient past, and how the cemeteries are celebrated and upkept. It's there. I mean, people
Yeah.
don't lose that. I think it's very I mean, thank God it should be. It's very difficult to kill a culture. People are still going to tell their stories to their children, and yes, they might take on different flavors, but you, at that root level of, what you learn from often your mother, if they that's I don't want to say that
Often
as
the
a
mother.
problematic thing, but that's something that comes up often in the history
Yeah.
of religion,
Yeah.
that they say it's taught by the mother.
Yeah.
Those are very deep human and cultural memories, and they don't get changed just like that.
Yeah.
I mean, we can even want to talk, I don't know, something you were saying before was also thinking, not just to talk about religion as an aspect of faith, talk about religion as an aspect of politics. Because I mean, it is the most convenient weapon in the world to do pretty
Absolutely.
much whatever you want to do.
Yeah.
There's nothing like, oh, God told me, now I have to do it. So I think even that, I mean, I like to see that in political fantasy, and where the elements of, do your characters truly believe? Have they convinced themselves? I think that's a lot of human history, unfortunately, is convincing themselves, this is right because my history says I have to do this. My God says I have to do this. That's a whole element in storytelling and history, unfortunately.
And people who say, well, I want to do this thing, and how can I manage it? Oh, I know. I can weaponize this element of the religion, which I may or may not feel deeply about. I may be a skeptic, but I know how to use it. We see that all the time with unfortunately, throughout history with leaders.
I opened up a U.S. paper.
Oh my God, yeah, yeah. And so if anybody has a question, please now put it in the Q&A. We love questions, although we can go on and on. Okay, I want to ask you, let me see. I asked you how you prepared yourself, kind of that scaffolding you create. I mean, I do a lot of reading. You do a lot of reading. We talk to people who know things, who hopefully, considerations. We talked about ignorance and expectations and how we have to deal with that. I wanted to add, I told you this before we started, my sister, my eldest sister is a medievalist, and she read The Adventures of Amina al-Sirafi, and she complained to me that it was being marketed as a fantasy because she felt it was just simply historical fiction, because as a medievalist, she considered what we would call supernatural elements to be completely historically appropriate for the book. So, and which I think is an important thing to think about with history and religion. Can you talk a little bit more about history, history and religion? We touched on this, like with religion as a political driver. Well, let me give you two options. Actually, never mind. Never mind. We already talked about that. We can come back to that if we need to. I wanted to talk a little bit about history of objects as a vehicle for story and setting, because objects have both historical and religious impact, right? And meaning, and they carry a lot of weight. You read that book, Abraham's Luggage.
Yes, I have it somewhere here.
Yeah, so can you talk just briefly about that? And then we do have a question about the history. I love material culture as a vehicle for story and for detail.
Yeah, I think honestly that's one of the best ways to really set a scene is to make sure. I mean, I don't like to necessarily write pages and pages of describing things, but if you really think about when you're setting a scene, the objects that they would have been using. I remember talking to the historian, she was like, you shouldn't have, don't have glass. They would have used wood or they would have used copper. And it's
Yeah,
those
yeah.
small details. Okay, maybe what would the room have smelled like? What would they have been burning? What would they have been eating? The cooking utensils. Something I was for my next book, I'm talking more about textile history. And when I was reading it, it was a reminder of wow, pretty much every person should be spinning thread. This was a constant thing that people
Yeah.
would have been doing. So if a group of women and children are sitting around talking, there would have absolutely been people, spinning thread as they did that. That was those little details that set things, I think. Something when I also like this the story of the book is just like the historian telling me things that I was wrong about. But I was very interested to learn. I was talking about, how Amina would pray. She rolls out her prayer mat, and they're like, no, she probably wouldn't have been wealthy enough to have her own, prayer mat. And then that also got me thinking, yes, think about, I live in the age of, everybody has their like mass produced textile. We all have our different mats, but they wouldn't have had that back then. And instead, Abraham's luggage was talking as well as that book. She would have prayed on her cloak. So it's just these little details,
Yeah.
what they would have wrapped their food up in,
Yeah.
that I think that's almost some of the best way to get your world building in without it getting in the way, is to just have those details that are different enough and evocative enough. It doesn't have to necessarily be like the plain ceramic bowl. I mean, can you maybe add a little bit more to that that's historical and just a bit different, a bit specific to that place and time? I think you can really set a scene very well.
I absolutely agree with that. I briefly, I read a book by some guy. Anyway, he was talking about the use of cloth and specifically silk in the Mongol courts post Genghis Khan. And one of the things that goes on is this gifting of robes, all the time gifting of robes. So, and I just went on this trip to Central Asia with a kind of a focus on textiles. And it was really fascinating to me to see these textiles and, are they all silk? Are they silk and cotton mix? And there's different words for each of those things. And these textiles are just incredibly beautiful. And it really had these two things that I was experiencing and that I had read. Therefore, they came together at that moment. And of course, spinning, how much time it takes just to hand spin things. And I thought, well, of course, you have these beautiful robes, this beautiful fabric. That is a sign, not just of it. It's like we don't think about that because we have these mass-produced clothes.
Yeah.
But to that, it was a big deal. And again, these little details that can just, if you walk into a room, you don't say they walked into a room, there's nothing there. You've got to put something in that room to ground it, right? And these are the objects that will ground both the room, but also give the reader more information. So I've got a question from Gayatri. How long did you spend, thank you, by the way, for being here, someone I know. How long did you spend on the research for Amina? And then the ads, really loved it. We'll appreciate all your book recs at the end.
Oh, thank you. Even getting back to textiles, you and I are going to have to do another entire podcast on textiles because that's one of my favorite aspects of history. And even as you were talking, I was thinking a detail that I always like is that in a lot of European paintings, they will show, especially early medieval paintings, they'll show in the hems what looks like Arabic, and it's Arabic, but it's just to show, oh, this was so fancy. It came from, an entire different area. I mean, talk about a detail that you can transpose to your own fantasy world in a different way. But anyway, I will stop getting excited about fake languages on fake cloth. My research process. So this is sort of a hard thing to describe because this was what I wanted to study originally. So I feel like I'm a terrible person to give advice on how to do historical research because I'm writing from things that I know and I kind of know where to go when I need to go deeper. And you do need to go deeper. But I would say I started writing the book. Actually, I know when I started writing the book because it was right when the pandemic started. So I was writing it right before I did virtual kindergarten with my daughter, which is its own circle of hell. But so I did a lot of the research kind of while I was writing, but that's because I was already coming from a background of knowing so much, or not so much, that sounds like a brag, but knowing some of this, to the point, actually, when I was in college, I interned with the Sultan Qaboos Center. It was an Omani cultural organization. And one of the things I worked on, I mean, I was 21 at the age, was an interactive map of the Indian Ocean, and it was objects. Oh, this one, it was their history. And
Yeah.
there's the field, the field has grown majorly since then. I mean, I'm 37 right now, but there's still so little that I found my own map that I had made like 14, 15 years ago when I was trying to do research, for this book now. So which was both kind of like, oh, okay, you've never grown in your interest. But it was interesting to see that. So I was coming from some background with this, and I think even in doing this, I was surprised, like when I would have to, go and do research for my character who's a former crusader. It was like you go on something and you realize like you can be in a very niche topic, and all of a sudden, I mean, talk about like not knowing what you don't know.
Yeah.
Especially I had that character come from where my own family comes from, and I still knew nothing. I was like, oh wow, I didn't know they would have been, still Byzantine all this time. But it was interesting. So I'm a bad person for telling people where to find research, except if you want to start, the one thing I do, this is a weird thing, I recommend history podcasts a lot of times, because
Mm.
podcasts and even sort of those lay history books you might go and find in the bookstore, they are already picking out the interesting details and the interesting stories that might kind of, pick your brain to then go further and deeper into something. It's not like, I mean, I love my dry academic text, but that might not spark the greatest of stories. So when people are starting out and they want to kind of just know more, I, go first for sources that are trying to provoke interest, because that might kind of be your gateway into something deeper.
I like this idea of going to sources that provoke interest. I like that a lot. And there's a lot of good history podcasts. I mean, you kind of got to get a sense of what's good and what is maybe not so good. But I think that's a great opening thing. The one thing I always say that people have heard me say before is you got to start by getting your basic foundational things. So you know what the ground is, and then you build, and then you get more and more, gets more and more detailed. But like, as you said, if I try to start reading something that's written for specialists, I don't know what it's like I'm at sea. I'm like swimming in the middle of the ocean and there's no island in sight, right? So I gotta get back down. And I sometimes, if I'm going into an area where I really don't know anything, I might even go to like a secondary school textbook just to say, here was this empire, here was that empire, and then build, and then I move up, and get more.
And I think it is, you just mentioned a good thing. It is a building, because I tell people also,
Yeah.
do not do all of your research before you read the book, because the more you research a topic, I guarantee you that scene will get cut for plotting reasons. Like, you don't want to spend too much time doing one thing until you're sure it's there. Save that true nitty gritty until you're at a higher level where you're not going to constantly be like, okay, I'm trying to draft, now I'm jumping on the internet to search something. I'm trying to draft, now I'm jumping on the internet to search something. Let it kind of go in levels of, first basic understanding, do your plotting, then deeper characterization. Like, I think that
Yeah.
there's a way you can very easily get completely paralyzed when writing history of that constant, like, now I have to stop and find this. Don't stop. I mean, we're all experienced writers here. Like, if you are in the zone with plotting, I mean, I'm drafting right now. I'm writing my dumpster fire first draft, and even I have to keep telling myself, like, you do not need to stop and learn
Yeah.
anything about being a goat herder right now. No one needs that shit.
Right. That's what revision is for.
That's what revision
you
is
could
for.
read that all. And I just want to say we actually are at the end of our time. And I just want to add, everything you read goes in to the churn, and it will all be useful somehow, somehow or other. Shannon, thank you. This is great. And now we are going to have to do textiles.
Yes, absolutely.
because I just spent 3 weeks looking at the most amazing textiles,
Oh,
and I know
wow.
nothing. I'm not even a textile person in terms of, like, I'm not a crafter, but just incredible.
Oh, that's just not amazing. I love them. I love when you can find them at museums because they're difficult to preserve.
After I only have a minute, so I'm not going to do it now, but hold on, after we close down and I'll pick up my Sherduk. I have my felt rug that I bought in Kokor in Kyrgyzstan. So thank you all for being here. Thank you, those of you on SFWA YouTube who are watching this some time later. Who knows? 1,000 years from now, it could happen. For those of you who are going to remain there, Jen, oh no, where did I write it down? Oh no, Nathan told me and now I can't find it. Jen Carner is going to be here for the writing date that follows this. And for those interested, John Scalzi is going to be my guest on November 19th, and we are going to talk about being online, social media, and the changing of social media in the 21st century. So it's going to be wild. And again, I want to thank Shannon for being with me today. This was fantastic. And
thank you for having me. This was a lot of fun.
It was, as I knew it would be. See, this is just a selfish thing for me to do. That's really all it is. And thanks to all of you. And I'm going to do 3 seconds of silence so that whoever fine volunteer does the stuff to put it up can have their place to cut. Thank you again.